tonight. I'm here with Christine Hurley, who was one of the early people involved with the Bailey-Boushay House in the early 90s. Chris, why don't you start by telling me a bit about your upbringing?
Sure. I was born on the East Coast, lived in most of my youth in the very northeastern corner of New Jersey, not too far from Manhattan, and was a product of a good old Irish Catholic neighborhood and church and an all-girls Catholic school for high school. And decided I needed to, I wanted not to go to school on the East Coast, so I thought I was choosing the Midwest and went to Ohio, which turned out not to be the Midwest, sadly, but it was further away than most places. And went to undergraduate school there and moved to Bellingham for a misguided reason, but it was perfect to get there when I was 20. Finished school fast on a sort of the get out of school program fast, follow your girlfriend to Bellingham. And then moving to Bellingham was sort of the beginning of what I think about as my real life in terms of my adult life, in terms of choosing and making choices about who I was and what I wanted to do in my world. You know, when you're 20, that's hopefully by then you can get something done. So that was my upbringing per se, and I lived in Bellingham for a couple of years, which was a really incredibly formative experience for me in terms of coming out and also finding a footing. I had been an academic, my only grounding was academic up until that point. I was thinking I was going to continue on being an academic, which would have been poorly suited for me, but I lacked imagination, and moving to Bellingham gave me a whole array of things to think about, mostly from a perspective of sort of finding my place in the world politically, but also from a practical place. It was a time of the early 70s, and it was such a time of excitement, and it was a great time to be introduced to all the things that were going on in the world in a more solid way, whether it was feminism or socialism or a whole array of things that were of interest to me, coming out as a lesbian, sort of connecting with others, and back to the overhead. It's like a war scene, sort of, I think, but connecting with others on different issues for the first time in my life, and realizing that I might actually have a way to find my way in the world practically by following things that were really interesting to me, that had nothing to do with things I had really studied, although I was always interested in politics and political theory from that perspective. But I ended up finding a whole connection of people in Bellingham that really led me to living in Seattle a couple years later and going to school again. But it was sort of really one of those wonderfully pivotal times in somebody's life when it really does make a difference about where you are and the people that you meet, and the ideas are just popping and connecting, and it was a really wonderful experience for me and formative. So that it led to many of my own pursuits in terms of political beliefs and connections that I continue to make to this day.
Okay. What channels did your activism take in Bellingham before you moved to Seattle?
Oh, I was involved in a ton of things. Mostly, I would say I was trying them out. My first venture was to try out get trained as a rape relief counselor. There was just a ton of women's issues that were very interesting to me. I discovered really fast that I was not really well suited for direct care and service. I seemed to lack, as a young person, empathy, which was apparent to me immediately in a hilariously bad way right away. But I was really interested in the things that right away that made organizations and groups of people work effectively together. And I would have never been able to describe it that way, but I knew I was not cracked up for a lot of things. I was involved in a women's health collective that was, basically working off the initial groundwork of feminism that led to women's health issues being a part of feminism, and were really important to my own thinking about health and one's control over one's body and the knowledge you need. But it became really also hilariously clear that I was not really that interested in becoming an unlicensed women's healthcare specialist, because I just didn't care enough about the speculum, the mirror, the flashlight, and the vaginal secretions. I just wasn't that fascinated with it. I was much more interested in helping us figure out how, as a collective, we were going to sort of appear in the world. I get a place to work and, connect with communities that needed services and other things like that, and how to get some money to do our work. That was much more interesting to me. So I was interested and was connected with the Northwest Passage, which was a left-wing weekly newspaper that was, I think it was twice a month, sorry. But it was a wonderful experience in terms of writing and putting together a newspaper that had a long standing at that point and lasted well into the late 80s, I think, is when it stopped. But and again, another collective venture, and a whole bunch of work, and actually many of the people I worked with in the Passage moved to Seattle at the same time when I did, to relocate the office here. And probably the beginning of anti-nuclear work that I did, which was, I would never say a major pursuit of mine, but it was one of those times where there was so much happening in the world. For me, there was not much formal LGBT. In fact, those initials weren't used in those days. There just wasn't a whole lot of gay activism, the liberation that I was connected with. While I knew many more people who were gay and lesbian in Bellingham than I ever could find in Ohio, in my college years, it still wasn't a formed activity that you could connect with. So that was the kind of stuff that I got to work on and got to learn about in Bellingham. And those were really interesting and helpful experiences for me. A lot of it had to do, formed in the end around issues of healthcare, but there were many other avenues that were just outlets for my political and social interests.
And when and why did you move to Seattle?
Well, formally I moved to Seattle to go to graduate school because I had, after a couple of years, I had figured out that, in fact, maybe what I would like to do is to figure out how to work on access issues and in community health. And I was really interested in healthcare, and I knew nothing about it. I was very interested in healthcare. My experience with healthcare was minimal. I just thought it was an interesting political question. Why do so many people in this country have extremely difficult times getting adequate care? And this, by the 70s, health insurance existed, and while it certainly wasn't as bad as it is now, the disparities in terms of access and outcomes were really clear then. Poor people didn't have access. People of color had worse. When you went to the Lummi Tribal Center, they had the hardest time getting care. And those interest me. And healthcare was a political issue that I chose in many ways because it was a great quintessentially interesting and meaty topic. And I could have chosen a lot of other issues to get involved with. Healthcare is bottomless in many ways, so it was really. So I came to school to go to the university, to go to graduate school in the School of Public Health, and that was another one of those. Oh, you decided to do that, and it made a lot of other things occur subsequently to that.
Okay, and what types of activism did you get involved with once you moved here?
Well, I continued right from the beginning. I continued to be involved in the Northwest Passage, but I also connected fairly quickly with people that I hadn't that I'd met when I was working in Bellingham through the Women's Health Collective. We had connected. Was a whole network of community health centers that were then in those days called free clinics in Seattle that I began to meet people with in that context. That whether it was people like the Fremont Women's Clinic or Country Doctor or the University District, the U District had a clinic called Open Door. There was a whole network. The Black Panthers had Odessa Brown and I'm forgetting the other name, but Black Panthers had 2 clinics that were operating. So there was a whole Carolyn Downs, yes, Carolyn Downs and Odessa Brown. Thank you. I had a mind absence, but so there were those connections were there. I ended up in the end I did my second, like my thesis project with some of the clinics in the South End working on dental, assessing dental need and other things like that. But it was really, that was a big way that I found my own way into the network of community health. The really wonderful experience that happened fairly soon for me after being here, I moved here in '75, in the end of '75, and in 1978, the initiative and the initiative 13, anti-13, was up for the ballot measure, which was an anti-discrimination ballot issue, and that for me was the first time I was ever involved in electoral politics, and at that level, and I never had been involved in anything like it. I'd never doorbelled. I'd never gone to political meetings like that. I'd certainly gone to a lot of political gatherings and collective meetings, but I'd never been involved in straight, we have to put these things aren't going to be on the ballot, and we have to go and talk to people. We have to figure out strategy. And, I was involved in a group of women that was, and we were, as usual, that happened so many times, the gay and lesbian world, particularly in those days, was pretty separated by both age, class, and gender. And so there were older, more established gay men primarily in the Dorian group, and others. There were the women who sort of came out of this group called Leftist Lesbies that coalesced, and there were others, and there were, thank God, there were a lot of people, because ultimately we needed a lot of strategy, and a good strategy that would affect and connect with voters. And in many ways, excuse me, it's like I'm having spider web attack. In many ways, we had to figure out how to really connect with and the electoral politics, and that was a totally new concept at that point, because we really hadn't been voting on these issues, and we didn't know all that we know about how to talk about the issues in a way that makes visceral sense to a person who's not connected to the issue personally. So ultimately, the pitch around privacy was what helped the initiative fail. I forget now actually which way we were going, anti or for, and initiative 13. Against. Yeah. We're anti, but ultimately it was the privacy issue, which is sort of exposing. I can remember there was the picture, the advertisement, the TV ad, which was a big deal to get, was really sort of like a peeping Tom kind of innocent photography of somebody inside their house, but it was somebody could be watching you and you're not safe, and it was the privacy issue that actually seemed to sway most people, and it was an incredibly affecting experience for me because of the power of sort of, for the first time, going and talking to people you didn't know about who you were. Even in those days, I think that there was a very the beginnings of that whole strategy of coming out, and the power of just telling someone that who you are, and connecting them to a real person who isn't like them, and about which they might have about whom they might have misconceptions and other ideas. So it was a great experience from that. It was so empowering because, at that point in my life, I was probably 25, and, it was really an incredible experience to, one we didn't have for a long time, which is actually winning, winning an electoral experience around an LGBT discrimination issue. And in my mind, for a long time, it was the missing piece in the state was we weren't able. It took us 33 years to get the anti-discrimination and fair housing lending and employment done in the state. It was incredible how long it took, and we got the basics done in Seattle fairly quickly.
And then, how early on did you get involved with AIDS activism?
My introduction to HIV was both through friends but the biggest dip that I had was through my place of employment. The Pike Market Clinic was a community health center down at the Pike Place Market, not necessarily naturally positioned by geography to end up being a place that had a reputation and a capacity for taking care of people with HIV, but it had a couple of things going for it. It had internists who actually rounded on people in the hospital. Many of the other community health centers didn't have their own docs. Their docs weren't their family practice. They might not have felt comfortable with HIV. And they didn't round on people in hospitals, which is a big deal. And we did at the clinic because we had mostly elderly. And we also had a really key ingredient, which was we had an incredibly active guy who worked at the front desk named Stan. Stan was a person who was involved in the gay clinic and had lots of friends who needed help. And because of Stan's connections, many people ended up at the clinic early on. So in 83 is the earliest when we started seeing sizable numbers of people with HIV at the clinic. And that really just sort of brought home everything you began to know about HIV in terms of what it was doing, how bad it was. And I left the clinic at the end of 83 and ended up working at Group Health till 1990. And during that time, even though it's a big place and I was mostly working as a hospital administrator, I got to work on a lot of interesting things within Group Health related to HIV because, in fact, very few people were interested. But Group Health had many ways to be connected to HIV. It had first of all, the provider of care to 500,000 people. So it had to figure out what the best way to serve people. And then it was also an employer of 10,000 people. So it had employment policies related to HIV and education issues and other things like that. And it was also an insurance company, and it had to figure out insurance policies related to and then the practices for HIV, all of which was a rich and fertile opportunities to get involved if you were interested and in a reasonable position within the organization. And it was at Group Health sometime probably in like 86 or 87 where I can remember talking about HIV to a colleague, and he's like totally clueless about HIV. And I was like, how is it possible that you know nothing about this illness? Group Health was not a big care center. It did not have, the population wasn't really demographically matched very well. But I just remember saying, how is it possible you know nothing about this? It's a disaster rolling out in our community, and you don't know anything about it. And this is a friend of mine, and I can remember saying, it's just shocking to me. And I said, I can remember saying out loud, and mostly to myself, if I could find a job that I could do related to HIV, and AIDS. Well, we didn't call it HIV. We call it AIDS, though. If related to AIDS that I could do, I'd do it. And honestly, at that point, I didn't know of any job that seemed appropriate. I wasn't gonna. What I understood is how to actually organize health services for people, and I really liked making new things in response to problems, and responding appropriately to conditions that aren't well served someplace else. That's my sort of interest and passion within looking at health services, and eventually, almost to my surprise, even though I knew very well about the planning for Bailey-Boushay and was close to the key people involved in the planning, it didn't really dawn on me that I would ever be an appropriate match for working there. I just wasn't thinking. I don't know why, but I wasn't thinking about it. And I got a call from a recruiter, which is probably the best way to have done it. I never gotten a call from a recruiter before, but I probably would have said, if one of my friends said, you should think about applying for this job, I probably would have not. I wouldn't have thought about it in the same way, but I got a call from a recruiter who was actually working at that time for both AIDS Housing of Washington, that was building the organization, building the building, and the operator partner was going to be the Sisters of Providence. And I got a call from the recruiter who was working for both of those sides, and ended up thinking about it and actually waiting a really long time while the whole politics of who was actually going to operate the building was settled. And ultimately, it was not the Sisters of Providence. They decided that it wasn't, if it was not a member of their order running it, they weren't going to be involved. And which was probably a good thing for them to figure out right away, because they had problems with condoms that somehow the early planning didn't reveal. And ultimately, when the decision came down for the board of directors, who was comprised of all nuns at that point, they said, we're not really down with this whole recruitment of an outsider. We really need somebody who's going to actually toe the line on our policies. It didn't say it exactly like that, but they said it has to be a member of our order, period. And so after 8 months of messing around with recruitment, the marriage between AIDS Housing and Sisters of Providence was not consummated, and ultimately they broke up, and ultimately Virginia Mason partnered up with AIDS Housing of Washington to operate it, and that's how I ended up coming to work at Bailey-Boushay. So can we take a break, and I'll just get that maple leaf out of your neck? So.
Okay.